Okay, for the record, today is the 26th of April, 2003. We're at the Peabody Public Library in Columbia City, Indiana. And we're interviewing Clark Waterfall from Columbia City. Clark was in the Veterinary Corps of the U.S. Army. He was in the Medical Detachment, Military Government, 3rd Army. He achieved the rank of captain. He was in the service from May of 1944 until May of 1947, including World War II. I'm Michael R. Hayes, a friend of Clark's. And so Clark, were you drafted or did you enlist?
Well, I enlisted, but I enlisted in the Army Specialized Training Program for college students. On that infamous day of December 7th, I was that afternoon in the library studying, and came out in the evening. There was a rumble in the library, but no one said what was going on. Came out to be very much surprised that the campus was in an uproar, because particularly the men students of the campus were gathering under street lights and what have you to discuss what had happened that day and whether to immediately enlist, because if they went to Canada they could, and we aren't too far at the campus to cross the border to Canada, they could immediately enlist in the Canadian Air Force. And they thought that'd be a better deal than waiting to be drafted in one of the corps. So it was a big discussion, and the very next day the president of the university, the groups that had gathered on the campus eventually ended up in the yard of the president of the university's house. And he came out and he pleaded with the students not to be irrational, to wait until they had more information, and that then they could maybe help them make up their mind as to what their best process was. But to stay in school, don't rush off. Many of them, however, did. About 3 days later, there was a big convocation of all students, including the female students too, telling a situation and offering a program whereby the students could finish their degree and then go automatically in the service. Those of us that, and I still had in my veterinary curriculum, I had a year and a half to go before graduation. So it looked like the prudent thing for me to do would be to sign up for ASTP. They pulled a train up on where they loaded the coal at the campus and took us all over to Kellogg, Fort Kellogg, Fort Custer in Kellogg, Michigan. And there we were inducted into the Army. And it was interesting that day. Of course, as we gathered in groups in our civilian clothes, why those already in uniform were yelling "rookie, rookie, rookie" at us. They'd been there all of 2 days, you see, or less. And they also watch out for that needle with the jet engine on, because we were all going to get vaccinations and what have you. We spent 5 days there, all of us assigned most of KP duty and things like this, drew our uniforms, loaded us on the train, took us back to college. We were then formed into groups. Some regular Army personnel come in to be over, so a sergeant and a captain actually. And we were assigned really to our ROTC units where we'd served in the college. We had 2 ROTC units on Michigan State College. One was the cavalry and one was the infantry. And I happened to be in the cavalry unit with horses, and which I enjoyed very much, and all. We were immediately subject to the Army rules and regulations of not being able to leave campus without passes, and We were fed in dormitories, fed in cafeteria-style dormitories. We had to report some evenings for training, and we had to also be on parade every Saturday afternoon on the parade grounds. At that time, I had a cousin who was in a bombardier, graduating from bombardier school, and his plane exploded on the last flight and he was killed. And I asked to go to South Bend to his funeral and was denied that privilege because that was against the Army. The Army didn't see it necessary that I make that trip, so I began to right away feel what the Army was about as far as their hold over you. But we went immediately on a speeded up curricula agenda, going the year round, so that I would have graduated in the spring of '44, but as a result of the speed up program, I graduated in the spring of '43. And I mean in the December of '43, I got that wrong. We were taken to, had buses at that time to go back to the commissary at Battle Creek. I said Kellogg, at Battle Creek, Michigan. Fort Custer was at Battle Creek, Michigan. Got this, and we were allowed to turn in our Army issue stuff, and with our first paycheck as first lieutenants, as they had promised to grant us when we graduated from school, we had to buy our own officers' uniforms and all the necessary equipment. And I thought it not proper for me, as graduating from college and in the Army as an officer, to hitchhike home as I did all through my college career. So I took the bus back to Fort Wayne, Indiana, where my family lived. My family, of course, because of rationing gasoline, could not come up to my graduation exercise, and it was a very subdued graduation exercise because of the war. Also awaiting me at my house with my home address was my first orders of where I was to report. And this was on, I arrived home on December 18th, and I was to report January 1st in Chicago to the Quartermaster Corps Center. My job was going to be inspections of meats and all food of animal origin, and to see that the companies that were supplying this to the Army were living up to the requirements for purchase from the Quartermaster Corps. So my first assignment was with a group of some 30 of us who had at our disposal a couple command cars that took us to the stockyards and took us to the food processing plants in Chicago. Now we lived in one old hotel at this time with a mess hall in it, and we were on a 24-hour call for 7 days a week. And we every now and then we would face a muster to make sure we were there and not running around someplace else. The inspection included dairy products, of course, and my most detestable job was testing and grading butter. You have a big long plug that you stick down into a barrel of butter, pull out the plug, break off a piece, put it in your mouth, wash it around your mouth. There was water there to rinse it out of your mouth. But and then you grade it as to taste and quality and texture and everything else. And of course, they were quite anxious, the sellers of the butter, because the higher grade, by the more money they got for it. And but the reason why I detested that job so is about you could not rinse all the grease out of your mouth. And about 4 hours later, you were subject to the call of nature, quite violently, and it lasted for a couple hours. And you knew it was going to happen. It didn't happen to everybody, but I was one of those that could. And so I really was grateful when I got assigned to packing plants and not dairy production plants. After completing that training, then I was given my orders to move on. I was sent to Fort Hays in Columbus, Ohio. I was there but 24 hours, and I was reassigned to Fort Benjamin Harrison in Indianapolis. And Fort Benjamin Harrison was only 130 miles from home, and I felt myself quite fortunate. Little did I know that I wouldn't get home any, because you had to have leaves and what have you. You couldn't leave on even weekends, you see. But from Fort Benjamin Harrison, we were assigned into Indianapolis to the packing plants and to the. My first assignment was to a poultry production egg plant, and the inspection of eggs, and they separated the yolks from the whites in this plant and froze them and shipped them to the armies overseas from that. And my job was to take a percentage of, and candles a percentage of the eggs to make sure you didn't have a chick in the eggs, and then to make sure that they were frozen in the proper length of time and everything, so that the Army did not have a problem with them. From there, I was assigned into the Kingham Packing Plant Company, where I was inspecting the production of hams and bacons, slaughter floor, all this, and was there in Indianapolis for the better part of, I'd say, 4 or 5 months. And then it was reassigned on detached service to Terre Haute, Indiana, to the Home Packing Company in Terre Haute. Home Packing Company was selling a tremendous quantity of products to service, and there was a major down there and myself as a lieutenant at that time. We were the lone inspectors, and our stamp of approval had to go on everything that went out of there. If we rejected it, the company officials, of course, losing money on that, were very unhappy with us and made us feel unhappiness. But that was where I was when the war ended. Now I had one other assignment there. Now in detached service, you're a little more free, because you didn't have to report to a commander or anything. You had your weekends more or less to yourself. You could do as you pleased on these things. So it was a kind of a nice detached service. I had purchased a used car down there, and I got around pretty well. And so it was. But when the armistice was signed, I thought, oh boy, I'm going home. I had a veterinary practice of an uncle waiting for me, and I had a serious girlfriend at the time, and I thought, this is it. I'm free, footloose, and just waiting my orders. When my orders came, it was reassignment overseas to the military government. So I was not as free as I thought for. My future wife at that time felt very blue about the situation that I was going overseas, and we decided we would get married before I left for overseas, and that we did, and we had, before my final orders came in as to where I would report, we had something like 8 or 9 days of married bliss before I had to go to Indianapolis, and my folks and my new wife took me to Indianapolis, and I boarded the train there for camp in South Carolina. I was to Columbia, South Carolina. I was assigned down there after 5 days of military education in military government. I found out that my job to be overseas was to help reestablish the Civil German Veterinary Corps in Germany. There were 5 of us veterinarians there at the assignment. We boarded a train, and after traveling all night and seeing Washington, D.C. in the early morning light, we went on to Fort Totem, New York. Arriving in Fort Totem, New York, I had a cousin and his wife that lived in New York City, and we found out that we arrived at Fort Totem after some orientation of about 2 or 3 hours. They turned us loose until 4 o'clock the next morning when we were going to board a plane. So we had from about 2 in the afternoon till 4 the next morning to enjoy New York City, and enjoy it we did. We immediately got a hold of the cousin, and he told me how to get to his apartment with other 4 veterinarians that were with me. And after a general greeting there, he said, "Well, what are you going to do?" And we said, "We want to see New York, anything in New York." So he had connections, and he called Billy Rose's Diamond Horseshoe and got us tickets for the show for that night and a dinner at Billy Rose's Diamond Horseshoe. And then from there we traveled up and down the bars of New York City. Saw the Three Sons in one of the bars, which was a popular musical group at the time. And one of us, there were of the 5 of us, 3 of us were married and 2 were not, and the 2 that weren't married picked up girls along the way, and I don't know just exactly what time they got back to the barracks, because we went after about midnight. We went back to the barracks, and they were still fully dressed when we got up, when we were called at 3:30 to go out to catch the plane. We had a breakfast, and we caught the plane, and there were only about 5 veterinary officers and about 3 or 4 others, and that was the whole plane load. But we weren't going overseas directly. We went to Washington, D.C. Landed in Washington, D.C., and there we picked up some big shots on the plane. There were 3 lieutenant colonels, and they real affable people. Well, of course, it was now about, I would say, about 10 in the morning when we took off from Washington and flew to the Azores. And it was still about 4 o'clock in the afternoon when we arrived, not the Azores, but Bermuda. Azores was the next stop. And we, of course, when we, at the landing field at Azores is right on about 2 feet above sea level, and if they overshoot, you're going to go in the drink. And of course, they told us we had to put our Mae Wests on and what have you to light there. Now, this was before jet travel, you understand. These were propellered planes, four-motored planes. I can't remember the number of the plane, but we had an hour and about 15 minutes at Bermuda. We immediately went there to the edge of the airport, hired a tourist horse and buggy for the 5 of us, and drove up and down the streets of Bermuda to see, what we could see. And got back to the plane. We took off and got to the Azores yet before dark that night. So they told us at the Azores, with the colonel, one of the colonels is with us, he says, whatever you do, you'll go in and you will be given a breakfast, or you buy the breakfast. Being all officers, you had to buy your meals. And you buy your meal, and whatever you do, get fresh milk, because that's the last chance you'll have to have fresh milk. And when we got in there, we were, well, come to think of it, we flew during the night. This was morning when we got these, it was not night. And we ordered our milk, and they were fresh out of milk, so none of us got milk. Well, this colonel, we visited with him on the plane. He seemed, he was a leaf colonel, lieutenant colonel, and he, when we got to Paris, flew into Paris, it was just getting dark. And one of the prettiest sights I ever saw was when the pilot could not land at Orly Field immediately because he was in the whole pattern. And he put his wing on the Eiffel Tower and made a circle around the Eiffel Tower. And as we were, it was just getting dusk, and the streets all come in spoke wheels into the Eiffel Tower, if you remember right, Mike. And they turned the lights on, starting at the tower, and they ran out like a ribbon, one right after another lighting, so they lit the whole wheel up. And we sat up there and watched those lights just tear down the street, you know, out to the suburbs. And of course, then we landed at Orly. It was now about 6:30, 7, and they assigned us our billets and told us there would be a plane out the next morning at 7 o'clock for Frankfort, Germany. Well, we said, we don't want that plane. We want to spend the day in Paris, you know. Well, the colonel that was with us, he was in the background. He stepped up. I'll take passage on that plane, he said. And then he turned to us and said, well, have a good time in Paris, boys. And the next day we did Paris, and that night we were in the Folie Bergère, and we got, you know, and then we went to a nightclub and saw sights I'd never seen before. And the following morning we were on the plane to Frankfort, Germany. We were told to report in to an office there. When we landed, we had our instructions, and the 5 of us went up to that. Lo and behold, the colonel that had been with us that took the trip was the man that we had to report into. When we saw him, our faces fell. Oh, we are in trouble, because we had taken an extra day, you know. All he said was, did you have a good time in Paris, boys? And we appreciated that so much, because there were 2 more veteran officers that worked with us that were going in with the same group, and they didn't take the day layoff in Paris, so they had reported in the day before. Well, they got better billets than we did, but outside of that, well, I can't say there was much difference. The man we reported to was an adjutant, and he then told us that we were to meet the head of the veterinary division for luncheon that noon in the officers' mess. And we got to the officers' mess, and the Colonel Ward was there, and he greeted us and told us about things to see and all, that we would be about 5 days in Frankfurt, and then we'd be assigned out to various places. All of us were military government personnel. It just so happens that there was to be the champion football game between Army divisions who had gone up through at the stadium in Frankfurt. Now, we reported into the IB Farben building, biggest complex, of be like our Pentagon at home. The Army, the Air Force had been told not to bomb the IG Farben building because they had planned that for their headquarters in setting up, and they hadn't. And this was one of the few things that was standing in Frankfurt. The Bahnhof, which is the railroad station, was bombed out when just about all the hotels were makeshift. We had no heat or hot water in our hotel that we were staying in, but those two boys that had the better assignments did have, so we went over and shaved each morning and took a shower over at their hotel. But we were invited to that football game to see the one I think was armored division, and I had never until we got to the parking lot of the stadium, I'd never seen so many different types of military vehicles. They had driven in from wherever they were stationed, you know, in their, and here were they all lined up. There were tanks, there were staff cars, there was everything. But we no more than got in line to get in the stadium, and we were called to step aside and stand at attention. And Eisenhower and Patton and Marshall passed us as down through the lines there. They spoke neither to any of us, but they headed into the game. Well, when we got in the stadium, we were sitting on one side, and they were sitting on the other side of the field. But at halftime, to show their impartiality as to football, for the football game, they came to the middle of the field where they were photographed and everything. There was a Bradley too. Did I mention Bradley? There was Bradley, Omar Bradley, and Patton, and Eisenhower, and Clark, General Clark, and they came over and sat on the other side of the field in the second half. So that's the last we saw of those. Well, in a few days we had our assignments, and I was assigned to Bavaria. Three of us were assigned, and we had to ride, and this was a cold, late October morning. In fact, there had been some ice on the Autobahn and what have you. And we were assigned to ride a 6x6, which had a cover over it, but open at the rear end, and it was cold. And there was a driver and assistant driver, enlisted men, and there was room for three in the cab, so every so often one of us got to go up front and sit in the cab, you know, where it was warm. We took our turns on that. And of course, we were quite interested, since this was our first look, to find out you went down the Autobahn so far and the bridge was blowing out, and then you went off the Autobahn down through a little narrow road, down through a narrow village, and back up on the Autobahn. They'd blown out the bridge across, you see. And we got a big kick out of seeing the way the farmers, these were little farm towns, they farmed their farm by going out to the farm and back in, so you might have to wait for the cattle to be driven down the streets. You might have to because these people lived in dwellings over the barns. That's where they lived. So you got a good look at Germany just from that trip. Well, we were all day going. We stopped at can't think of the name of the town, and went to an army mess for dinner that day. And then we came on in and we got into the 3rd Army headquarters in Munich. We were to be met there by a Captain Gov't, who was the veterinary officer for the military government at the time, and he was counting on us to be his replacement so he'd get to go home. And the three of us we were standing on the steps waiting to go in to sign in, when all at once we were able to come to attention. And we did, and here's Patton coming down. I could have reached out and touched him. And of course, Patton had an assigned uniform for that area, and it was combat boots and Eisenhower jackets, Army issue Eisenhower jackets, and not the officers' hats, but caps, you see. And here we stood up like sore thumbs because we were out of uniform. And he stopped in front of us, and he said to the colonel there that was with him, he says, "Find out why these men are out of uniform." And the colonel come over to us, and the general would like to know why you men are not in uniform. And we told him we just arrived. He went back, and I heard the general shook his head. Of course, he carried the crop with him, you know, as it was customary. We saw Eisenhower many times after that until he was killed. He killed in an automobile accident out on the Autobahn. But we were told, the colonel came back to us and said, "You have 24 hours to get into uniform." So that night we were assigned to billets, and we spent the evening in the commissar buying more clothes to match what was required of us in the uniform. Groppe, the man we were supposed to report into, wasn't available. We were not sure just where he was. Kind of think he was with his girlfriend someplace, a German girlfriend. But the next day then, he took us out. We all ate breakfast together. I said there was 3, but actually there were 5 of us. Our original 5 was there. So one of his questions was, "Do any of you fellas play cribbage?" I was the only one that played cribbage. I got the plum assignment, that was Munich, because he wanted somebody to play cribbage with, and those other 4 officers were all signed out to outlying areas. I got Munich, all because I could play cribbage, how things work out. And so Groppe told me that I was to report then into the medical group, the military medical group, and told me that the next morning that I would be there at 8, and I was assigned billets in the building where their officers were. They had a mess there, they had an officer's lounge, they had a theater, they had everything in that building. And so I reported in, there were 2 medical officers, MDs, there was a sanitary officer, there was a veterinary officer, and there was a nurse, an Army nurse. And all of them busy at desks or what have you, and the place was full. All of them had a German interpreter with them. I was replacing a man by the name of Calhoun, and he had left a day or 2 before I got there. So I stood on one foot and then another, nobody paid any attention to me. I reported in, and finally the colonel, his name was Pasquera, he was a lieutenant colonel, head of the detachment. He come out of his office and he was introduced to me. He went back in his office. A few more minutes, he come back out again. He says, "Why hadn't this man been given a desk?" Well, I found out that the Calhoun, the veterinarian that had been there before I, had done nothing. They were all disgusted with it. They absolutely wanted nothing, and they assumed that all veterinary officers were alike, you know. And he had been a bird, apparently. And so they had just more or less ignored me. So they rushed around and they got me a desk in there and all. And from then on, as I won my way in by doing the work, why they accepted me in the office, and that was a great relationship with the officers there. And we had, and you got to remember, in the Medical Corps generally, rank is not respected to the degree it is in other. They all have their professions, you understand, and you, of course, you saluted them, and you, yes sir, no sir, and you stood at attention. Not very often, you know, you were just a buddy. And in the evenings, you played hearts in the officers' lounge, and you were more like the same rank, and everybody was the same. And it was a different feeling than you generally had in general officers. But from there, I, of course, was assigned the equivalent of my rank of a German veterinarian. Well, denazification, am I talking too long here, Mike?
It's okay.
Denazification at that time was, the Americans did it different than the Russians. The Russians said, you'll do it this way, and put a gun at your head, and you, to the Germans, you understand. The Americans, they would not be as critical of denazification and things like this, but still there were rules that you had to abide by. Well, it was awful, and the rules stated at that time that you could not put a German in a government position if he had been more than a nominal member of the Nazi Party. And a nominal member was described as to dates they joined the party. And so certain dates before, anything after that, you were considered a nominal Nazi because you joined because you were forced to, you see. Before that, it was your own decision. Well, as a result, all the middle-aged men were Nazis. And so my counter-opponent, which would have been the equivalent of a state veterinarian at our level, he's really a district veterinarian of 3 states. There were 3 states. He was 76 years old. A Prussian, if you ever saw one, stood about 6'4", shaved head, black suit, scuffed up black shoes, always a tie on, but a celluloid collar. Remember the old celluloid collars? Ramrod straight. When he stood up there in front of you, boy, he was full attention, and he was the old officer type, you know, and he had no love whatsoever for the Nazis because they had caused the problem that his country was in. But he was fully cooperating. Well, they had a system whereby every county had a county veterinarian. He was paid by government money for his position. And you have to remember the Germans honored anybody in a command position, regardless of how low it was. There was a pecking rank, you know, and so they honored those positions that get one of those positions, because then when they had their banquets and things like that, they got to set up the head table and all. You know, they took great pride in that. Well, Altman was to appoint all the Christ being county, all the county veterinarians, and then I had to approve them, you see, and I had to tell them what their assignments were as to reporting of disease, inspection of farms, everything. And that one of his problems was that these all were all old men, you know, and so one day he come in, and I had 2 incidences which did my training as a veterinarian helped. I mean, and one of the first was that he come in one day, Hoffman, and from his celluloid collar to the top of the head, he was redder than a beet and mad. Boy, he was mad. And all I could get out of his German, and of course I had an interpreter there, but all I could get out was, Dummkopf. Well, I understood what Dummkopf was. He was mad. He had found at the Arbitrar, the plant for getting rid of dead livestock, you know, they had discovered anthrax. And the veterinarian that had sent the animals in had not detected, but he had allowed in other words, these animals were to be destroyed before they ever got into a place, a rendering plant, you see. And he had not checked on it. And he was yelling Dummkopf because he had done the same thing before the war. He had been the Christ veterinarian at that time. He had allowed the anthrax animals to be buried in a wooded plot. Well, anthrax is a spore former which is not killed because of a spore around it, a casing around it, will live forever in dirt, and then once it gets into the right environment, it can be reactivated. Well, this wood plot, the one that he allowed them to be buried in the first time, was during the war they needed the wood, so they sawed up and they planted this to sugar beets, and they fed the sugar beets to the cows, and the cows got anthrax. And he was mad, 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 because this man would do such a stupid thing again. Oh man, we went out to the arbitrator, and of course we made him clean it up and everything else. Well, that was something that my career had taught me about, was the anthrax and thing. The second most important thing that I probably was the first one to discover as a military in military government, was that we had garbage dumps around our army camps. We were importing from our country hogs. They had a great shortage of pork in Germany. And Germany had not been real strong on pork up until that time. I heard about an outbreak of disease on a hog farm in Germany. Herr Hoffman, my counterpart, said, well, we've got sickness out there and we have no idea what it is. We're losing a large number of hogs. Well, I went out to the farm with him. I posted a hog and diagnosed hog cholera. So happened that at that time in our country, we were using a live vaccine to protect our hogs against hog cholera. We inject the virus, we inject the serum that would protect them from the virus. They would build up antibodies and they could live. But these hogs were arriving over there with that live vaccine still alive in their body. The garbage collectors were picking up the garbage, feeding it to the hogs, and they come down with hog cholera. So that was twice that I had felt that my education had warranted some of my long time over there, what I considered a long time over there. Having just been married, I wanted to get back home, of course. There were a few other instances. We had one other instance in which when we got ready to bring, if you'd sign on for so long, you could bring your family over to Germany. And they were looking for pasteurized milk source, because largely at that time they had what they thought eliminated the disease brucellosis, which is causative of disease in humans. And they did not pasteurize milk over there. So there were just few dairies that pasteurized milk. And we were to locate these dairies and approve them so that the Army could take milk from these for the dependents that were coming over, you understand. Got out up to Oberammergau, Germany, where the Passion Play is. And the most modern dairy you want to see was in this little tourist town, which they had the Passion Play every 10 years at that time. And I had another medical officer with me that had been educated in Germany, medical school, so he spoke fluent German. When he heard that I was going to have to go up to Oberammergau, he said, well, I'm not that busy, let me go with you. We went into this dairy up there, very modern, clean, wonderful dairy. And as we pulled up in our Jeep, we were driving our own Jeep up there, we had saw a man go out the back door of this with a rucksack on, skis on. And he went up the mountainside with these skis and a chicken foot type of thing, you know, and we watched him and marveled at how fast he was going up that thing, you know. Well, we got in the dairy and we asked for him. Well, he's gone for the day. He's up in the mountains. We now know that that was him leaving. Of course, we were two Army officers in Army uniforms. His son came out first, who was, I suppose, 7, 8 years old. And he says, well, what do you want? Well, we want to see the owner of the plant. Well, he's not here, I'll get my mother. Well, this little German lady had come out, and she was wringing her hands through her apron, you know, just, oh, she was nervous as 2 Army officers, what we were going to do, you know. We tried to calm her down, we tried to explain that what we were after, everything, the only reason we were there and everything else. We inspected the plants, they had our full approval and everything. We had her sign some papers and things like this. She never quieted down, boy, I tell you, she was really nervous. 2 weeks later, in the Army paper, came out that Joseph Meyer had been the Christus for 3 plays of that, and Joseph Meyer was the block leader, the head Nazi in the area, and he was arrested. No wonder she was nervous, you understand, but we had no idea at the time that Joseph Meyer was that man or anything like that, so that was another incident that happened. Of course, when my military time was done, I did not have enough time in, because by then you were getting 2 points a month, and you had to have so many points to get home. So I was reassigned out of that to the 4th Medical Laboratory in Darmstadt, Germany. Darmstadt had been the site of where the Germans had a laboratory trying to develop from heavy water the atomic bomb. The medical laboratory was set up there, and it was the theater lab for the whole theater. Now, how am I 90 minutes coming here? But anyway, I was assigned there, kind of a plum assignment, because I was with a staff of 1 medical administrative officer who was in charge of the laboratory, the paperwork on it, 12 pathologists who were looking at samples of diseases and things like that, and any outbreak in the Army or anything like that, and 1 veterinary officer, that was me. And so there were 14 of us officers in there. I was assigned some other duties besides, well, what was my duty as a veterinary officer? Well, at that time, our women's corps of the Army, our nurses, even our Red Cross workers over there, could not get home unless they were pregnant. That if they could prove a pregnancy, they could be shipped immediately home. And there was those who purposely got pregnant to get home. I suppose they had a steady boyfriend or something like this, but they purposely got. There were others that would have, and they offered me bribes. I mean, bribes to find them pregnant. Well, how did we test for pregnancy at that time? We took the woman's urine, injected it into the ear vein of the rabbit, did a laparotomy in 3 days on the rabbit, and the ovaries would have been bursting with eggs. I mean, it was quite obvious. We had such a shortage of rabbits that in this country, you just destroyed the rabbit. We sewed them back up again, gave them some antibiotic to keep them alive, and then we had to wait a month before we could do the procedure again. And we had officers' wives over there that we tested their urine. We had officers' German girlfriends that we tested the pregnancy for. So that was. We also had some other tests. We had skin tests, what they call DIC, and for scarlet fever, and some other tests that we did in the veterinary division of that. I had 3-4 corpsmen working under me, and 2 German ladies, and they were good. I mean, I did some of the operations, but most of the time I turned it over to them, because I was busy doing paperwork and things like that, and taking leaves to Denmark and Switzerland and what have you. But from that, I was also appointed mess officer. Well, we got tired. One thing you got tired of, or I got tired of, is pineapple. we kept canned pineapple, and we had pineapple in every form, from pineapple upside down cakes to pineapple pies, everything you could think of. And I got so tired of pineapple. And the other thing was, we got so tired of mutton. Just absolutely hated mutton. Well, my Army sergeant had been an old-timer. He knew his way around pretty well, you know. So he began to take the mutton and the pineapple, cans of pineapple, and some other cans of stuff he had, and he traded to the Germans for fresh vegetables and fresh meat. And we had the best in the Third Army of Germany. Well, our reputation got out, and they would get maybe within 150 miles of us on papers. They'd leave their paper command to get into us for mess at night or at noon, you know. Well, they were supposed to sign a roster, but they were beyond their orders. So they couldn't divulge that they were there. So, you know, we had signatures of Adolf Hitler and what have you, you know, down there on our roster. Well, when you had an open mess like that, you had your draw depended on the number you were feeding all the time. So you had to take this list and add to it for the draw. And we had colonels, you know, and even generals come down to our mess. And we had some outstanding chefs, and we had the sergeant that knew how to procure it, you see. Well, 3 days before I come home, we got a notice that we were way we'd way overdrawn the amount that we were going to do, and of course that meant probably a court-martial down the line, you see. So I said to the sergeant, what we going to do? We set up all one night. We signed every name you could think of, every friend we ever had, everybody else. We had to come up with hundreds of names, Mickey Mouse and Minnie Mouse and everything else. And I had my orders to come home. Well, I was scared to death, you know, something was going to happen. And it haunted me because I had something like 3 months of leave time coming after I got home, so I was still in the Army, even though I'd signed up out at Great Lakes, where they discharged me. I wasn't fully discharged till some 3 months after I was home, you know. I sweat it out. I never knew I never heard anything more about it. I often wondered what happened to Sergeant, because he's a regular Army sergeant. But apparently he got by with it or something that I never had. But so that was, I came home, I'd gone over by plane, and I had to go to Bremerhaven and catch a ship. I was coming home in November, and they all told us that November was the toughest month to cross the ocean, that it got rough and that you'd be sick and everything else. And when we come down through the English channels, it was choppy. And I kept telling myself, we're in the English Channel here. If you're sick now, what you going to be when you get out on the sea? You know. So I guess I psyched myself out of it because I was one of the few that wasn't sick. They were all tossing, you know. We got out of the English Channel. It was smooth crossing all the way across. Come in, of course, we come into New York City, and from there we were railroaded out to I've forgotten the name of in New Jersey, and from there we caught a sleeper train to Chicago. And I called my wife, and she met me in Chicago, and we had decided that when I got discharged, I'd have to take the elevated back in to pick her up at the train station, and that we'd just stay there a couple of days in the Knickerbocker Hotel, and we got to see Oklahoma on the stage that one night. And that was kind of interesting because they were sold out full, and the man at the ticket office, there were a group waiting there, and I told him I just got home from overseas and I wanted to see Oklahoma. And he says, well, you can wait here with the rest, and if anybody cancels, you can. So I just stepped back and I just kind of watched that man, in a few minutes it gave me the eye. I stepped up there and we had box seats on the side for Oklahoma at the same price. I said, what do I owe you? And he told me this much. And I sort of laid down an extra $5 and he shoved it back. He says, I owe you that much. And we got to see Oklahoma on that night. And the next night we got in to see in the, what's the big hotel up there. Got to eat there and we got to see Hildegard, who was quite a pianist, you know, and singer and all. And so then the next night we come home. We came, got into Fort Wayne, of course, on the train. At that time it was streetcar 6, went up on State Street, was within 2 blocks of my home, and Margaret and I got on the trolley, and we, my mother was working at Pollock Dress Factory, and I knew that she usually, when she'd come home at night from work, she'd go into a little grocery store there on State Street and walk home with her groceries. And lo and behold, Margaret and I got off the bus there and we went, looked in the window, and she was in the grocery store. If Margaret hadn't, I got tears in my eyes when I tell this. If Margaret hadn't caught her bag of groceries, it would have gone all over. Because I walked up behind and said, "Can I carry your groceries, lady? Her son's home." Wow, that was good.
Yeah.
So I then came over about 3 days. I come over to Columbus City, and Margaret and I got an apartment, and I started to practice with her. And that was in 46. And I wasn't really out of the Army till 47, but I started really January 1st, 46 to practice.
And you practiced until?
And I practiced, well, it's hard to say until. I kind of slowed down and went in part-times, did book work and things like that, and I think you'd have to say that I was in practice I was in practice till 87. From 47 to 87. I think, well, probably closer to 92 though, when I finally quit altogether. But, so, and it's been a great run. I look back on my Army experience, and they paid me a vacation overseas. It's just too bad I couldn't have taken my wife with me, but that's what amounted to. I got to see places I would have never seen, when I was a son of depression. We were poor all through my grade school, high school. We were poor as mice, after having gone over there in the Army and seen things, we got to go back, I think 3 other trips overseas, Margaret and I never got off the plane that I didn't feel like kissing the ground and saying, "My, oh my, as poor a boy as you were and the things you've gotten to do." You know, it's just amazing that, life's been awful good to me. Outside losing Margaret, it's been very good. So, I hope that's what you wanted.
That was excellent. I thank you very much.
You're welcome. I'm glad I could do something for you.